Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It is wonderful to see everyone here. I'm Catherine Gelband. I am the chair of the collective grant process this year. I'm just really excited to have all of you here. Thank you to all of you who participated during the LOI phase. There was a lot of work. There were a lot of LOIs that came through from some great organizations, and I think each of the committees has reached a wonderful set of the 10 that will be going through the research phase. And welcome to those of you who are joining us for just this phase. This is a new thing we're doing this year, and I think it's really exciting that we have the flexibility to have you joining us. This is a wonderful opportunity for that deeper dive. And I think we have learned in the past years that we all have had the benefit of enormous education in this phase of the process. And it really does lighten the load for the nonprofits. And that is a critical part of the way that we want to be doing work. So thank you so much for your efforts moving forward. I think it's going to be a really wonderful year. We're going to kick off with a Mentimeter, our usual tactic. And this Mentimeter, we're going to ask you to answer the question, what are you hoping to learn in the research phase? And there's the menta.com, and there is the code. And it's also in the chat. Thank you, Aviva. Going to slowly populate. Accountability and process. Well, I think we're going to cover both of those things today. Today, we're going to look at impact. I think that's a really wonderful word for one of the things we're going to try to understand and explore for all of the nonprofits who have reached the final 30. We have in the chat how to learn about nonprofits and how their work aligns with the foundation goals. Trust base. I think that is a critical underpinning to what we're doing and how we are doing this work. And so I'm excited that we are going to explore what that means, and that will trust base always involves some discomfort. So I think we will all also have an exercise in getting comfortable with what we can find and also what we can't find. Community-based work. I think the organizations that I have seen so far as part of the 30, we're going to have plenty of those organizations that are responding to a need that they see in their community. And I think it should be a really interesting exploration of how they respond to that and how they respond to that in a way that addresses inequity. So that combination, I think, is really going to be interesting. Fiscal policy process, deep dive. I love that. This is going to be a deep dive, deeper understanding and grassroots action. I think, that the community-based work and grassroots action are definitely linked. So we're going to be excited about that. And fiscal policy, we're going to, everyone has given us some of their financials, and we'll talk this afternoon a little bit about what we're going to do with those and what we need to worry about and what we don't. So I'm excited about that. And then collaboration, what I think those organizations that work in community often do have a lot of collaboration as part of that work because it's all interconnected. So anyway, Aviva, I think this is a great one. Thank you.
I agree. I love these just to think ahead about all the learning that's to come. And if you are in the middle of putting in your response, go ahead and keep them coming. I am gonna switch the screen share to our presentation. Just give me one moment on my smooth logistical maneuvering here. All right. Here we go. Okay, so you should all be seeing the screen now, seeing some head nods. Okay, good. It's always good to make sure that what's supposed to be on your screen is indeed on your screen. So now that we know kind of what you want to learn, we're going to dive in, and I want to just add my gratitude to Catherine's for all the great work that you all did in the LOI phase, if you participated in that phase. And if you're just joining us for research, as Catherine said, welcome. We're glad that you're here. If you're joining us for this training and you're not part of the grant committee, that's fantastic. We're so glad you're here. And if you decide, actually, I do want to jump in and I have a little bit of time at the end of this, stick around and we'll get you in a work group. I also just wanted to say, as throughout the whole grant process, we really do welcome your feedback. So at any point in time, we will send a survey out at the very end, but at any point in time, feel free to send Catherine, Alyssa, Bobby, or myself your thoughts along the way. And so let's get started with a couple basics. So first, our core funding criteria. As you did with the letter of inquiries, keep these in mind while you do your research. Remember that we're looking for organizations that fit all elements of our criteria. And you've done this initial assessment that the 10 organizations you'll be researching do fit with the criteria. So this time what you're really looking for is digging deeper, and how does this criteria show up specifically for each organization? And the criteria here is on the screen and in your guide as well. As we went over for the LOI phase kickoff, all of our grants are unrestricted. I know that many of the LOIs that you read describe specific projects or programs. It was something that was tussled with as part of the LOI phase. Organizations that might do a lot of different things, but have one project or program that really fits super well with the priority area. And as you move forward with your research, you'll learn more about those specific programs, but you'll also learn more about the organization as a whole. And I want you to keep in mind that regardless of what an organization focused on in their LOI, our funds are unrestricted. So funding decisions should not be made solely on what an organization might have shared that they intend to do with the funds specifically. Our goal is really to learn about and support an organization as a whole. We're shifting really from that, what are you going to do with the funds question, to a different mindset of how can we support your work, your organization. In our research, as Catherine mentioned, we really begin from a place of trust, knowing that organizations know their communities best and how to best use those grant funds. And if this is somewhat uncomfortable for you, remember, lean into that discomfort. It's one of our core values as an organization, right? And it can be uncomfortable to do something different, but know that you can lean on each other as well as you go through that process. Next up, I wanted to review quickly the expectations for participation, especially in your work groups. So we want you to try your best to only miss one meeting in each phase. There are only 2 meetings. So if you could miss none of them, that would be better just for your own experience of being able to hear the discussion and the research that your fellow work group members have uncovered about all of the 10 organizations. But if you have to miss one, that's okay. And participation really is helpful, especially in the voting meeting, which is the second meeting of the two. Confidentiality. Organizations have shared with us information, so we want to keep that information confidential. You'll also find information online, so there's going to be varying levels of confidentiality. And confidentiality also applies to your discussions and to questions that you have about your research. Any questions or concerns should be directed to your work group leader and through the team, the staff team. And we ask that you don't approach organizations outside of that. We want to make sure to respond to the trust that organizations give to us when they give us information by keeping that information confidential. In this phase, we do have an opportunity to give nonprofits feedback, which is fantastic. I wish we had the capacity to give organizations feedback at the LOI phase, but there's a lot of LOIs, as you all know. And again, of course, we do this through procedure and we do it through the staff team, through myself. Many of you know people in organizations applying and maybe they've asked for feedback about the LOI phase if they didn't make it through. The best approach, I would say, is that, if there's someone who asks you, a friend or a colleague who says, I hear you're a member of the foundation, what can you tell me about the grant process? You can share your personal experience, but if they have specific questions, best case scenario, you tell them to get in touch with me and you can just directly connect them to me. You give them my contact information. I'm always happy to chat with them. We'll go through how we collect feedback in a more formal way at this stage of the process later on as well. I wanted to touch on biases quickly. As you conduct research, just as what happened when you were reviewing LOIs, you will be confronted by your own biases. And it'll show up in lots of different ways, and it might even surprise you how it shows up in research versus reviewing, things like a written grant proposal and things like that. So it might show up as a concern about the materials or an assessment of their website as difficult to navigate. And I really just encourage you to lean in and share what came up for you and your biases during your research with your work group members, your partner. And you might be surprised to hear that they are going through the same thing as they do their own research as well. And finally, a reminder that we're doing something relatively new. By doing our own research instead of asking organizations to submit proposals, we're really leaning into the trust-based philanthropy ideal of doing the homework. And it's fantastic. I mean, the materials that organizations have shared and the comments they've shared with me about how much they appreciate us taking on this burden. It's a huge shift in the philanthropic landscape, and people are really paying attention to us. And we also know that it's potentially challenging and that we will all continue to learn and support each other in this process. Last thing I want to review quickly before getting into a couple logistics is around risk. So one of the most difficult considerations is the inherent balance in philanthropy between safety and risk. And we talked about this at the LOI phase, and I think it's worth revisiting. In philanthropy, we are often less comfortable with risk, which means that nonprofits are rarely given the opportunity to explore new, untested ideas. And in a grants process, when organizations share their work with us, it's really our role to decide if the work aligns with the criteria. Our goal as well is for you to be comfortable with the fact that all grants have risks. So we're not saying we want to find the one organization that is not risky. We're saying all grants have risks. That's inherent in what we are doing together. What we're trying to sort out together is that a strategic risk. And we can never expect everything to go perfectly. That's not our goal. But if we want to invest and support and partner with organizations, we want to understand and accept that this work can often be messy, and we gain as much from failure as we do from success. So I encourage you to really take some time as you're going through this research to think about risk in the context of equity and how we might perceive things that are unfamiliar as risks, when in fact, the reality is that it's uncomfortable to see an organization addressing an issue differently than we would. We might say, this is what they should be doing, and they have a totally different approach. And I definitely heard some of those conversations in the LOI phase of those assumptions being challenged, and they will probably be challenged again at the research phase. So try again to approach your review with trust, trusting that an organization knows its community best, knows how to address needs within the community. You saw in the LOI phase that tips for incorporating a racial equity lens document, and I encourage you to go back to that tips document again and support each other in this work by helping each other when you see biases come out. So we have the benefit of doing this work together, and I hope you'll lean on each other as for some support. All right, so on to logistics, and then we'll talk about the research itself. So as with LOI review, we encourage you to approach that research with curiosity and an open mind. It's really a learning opportunity, a chance to do a deep dive into some organizations and their role in the landscape of all these different nonprofits in our state. So you'll be assigned organizations. Typically, work group leaders assign organizations in pairs. Using the research guide, which I'll send to you following this meeting, you and your partner will tackle the initial research. Organizations have had the opportunity to share with us their thoughts on where we should begin their research. So you'll have a helpful starting point and some materials from them as well. All of those materials have been uploaded to Reviewer. So when you go into Reviewer, you'll navigate to the attachments tab, and you'll see a budget from each organization, as well as some sent lots of documents, some sent just one or two, some sent some links. For many of them, I copied information on links and additional places to research into a document called Research Guidance. So take a look, an eye out for that research guidance document as well. So once you've done your individual research with your partner, you'll discuss what you've found and decide on 5 organizations for conversations in your research phase meetings with your work group. So you'll share short presentations with your work group on what you found about each organization, and then you'll discuss and decide on 5 organizations to move forward to conversations. Next piece of this whole puzzle is preparing research summaries. So with your partner, you'll draft a 1-page summary of what you found in your research, regardless of if they're moving forward to conversations or not. This is how you'll share what you've learned about these organizations with the rest of the membership. So if you find elements that you think would be really compelling or interesting or useful to include in your written summaries, take notes as you research, and then it'll be easier to put those summaries together. What I'll do is once we have all 30 summaries, we'll put them together in a digital booklet that will be shared with the membership in April so that they can stay up to date on what you all are learning on the grant committee. The other piece of deliverable for you all is the feedback form. So this is specifically just for organizations that are not moving forward. It's very helpful for us to be able to provide feedback to organizations about why they are no longer under consideration. So you'll work together as a work group to brainstorm what feedback you'd like to share during your meetings, and you'll work together to finalize that form as well. The way that feedback gets shared with organizations is in a phone call with me, if they'd like. I always offer to set up a time to talk with them. And not everybody wants to have that conversation, but the ones that do really end up being a great relationship building opportunity with organizations, even as they're not moving forward in the process. So briefly, I want to go over the timeline for all of those steps. So you'll have 2 weeks for that individual research where you're reading all the materials and reading their websites and all that good stuff. Then you'll have 2 research phase meetings. Those are happening at the end of March. And you'll have some time to put together those research summaries, feedback forms, and any ideas you have for things that should be covered in the conversations on April 4th is when those are due. One change I wanted to note from last year, if you were part of the grant committee last year, we're no longer holding office hours during the individual research phase. We had maybe 1 or 2 of you come last year, and I enjoyed those conversations very much, but seemed like it was not the best way to offer support to members as they're going through research. So instead, we're just going to make sure that we have availability. So if you reach out with a question to myself or Catherine or Alyssa or Bobby, we can respond quickly, hop on a call, talk things through, and address anything that might come up as you're going through research, whether that's, I don't really understand what this document's saying, I can't find what I need to find, anything of that nature. And lastly, before we get into what you're researching, I just want to note that I'll send you meeting invitations so that you have those calendar invites with a Zoom links later today so that you have it all set in your calendar. So that's it on logistics. I did see my chat thing flash open. I wanted to make sure I'm not missing anything before we move forward. Okay, Diane asked, will there be a template for the summary? Yes, absolutely. So I'll share that in the Dropbox in my follow-up. And Sarah asked, what is a strategic risk? Oh, what a great question, Sarah. Hmm. I guess that's maybe sort of everyone might have a personal definition of what's a strategic risk based on their own risk tolerance, right? I guess what we're looking for is organizations that have that really good fit with the grant criteria, and maybe they are trying something new and untested, and that might seem like a risk. But if they also have, the plan to back it up, the organizational infrastructure to back it up, that to me would feel like a strategic risk. I would encourage others to share their thoughts in the chat. And Catherine, if you wanted to chime in, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
I completely agree with you. I think it's really just an assessment of um, as- believing that they understand what strategy is best for their own community.
Very well put. Thank you, Catherine. And great question, Sarah. Thank you. Keep them coming. All right, so I'm going to move us on to the research itself. Okay, so we have 6 key questions we are trying to answer through our research. And the reason we have developed these 6 key questions is to help you focus your research. There's so much we can learn about these amazing organizations, and you're going to want to share every single thing you learn with your work group and the broader Washington Women's Foundation community. So our hope is these 6 questions will help us focus, and I'm going to go through each one. And these are the 6 questions you'll also answer on your research summary. So the first question, what inequity does this organization address? You would likely have a good sense of this from the letter of inquiry, but this is your chance to learn more about the issue itself. So if an organization mentions a research study or news articles on the inequity that they are addressing, for example, issues in re-entry support and inequities in that space, then you can read up on the issue itself to better understand how the organization's work fits into addressing this inequity itself. Second question, who does the organization serve? Again, this is also likely covered in the LOI briefly, but this is your opportunity to dive a little bit deeper and learn more about the community itself. What are the unique skills they bring? What are the unique challenges they face? And we think in the LOI, you saw that we think in communities in terms of geography, socioeconomic, race and ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So think broadly about when communities, when we talk about who they're serving. The third question is, what is the impact the organization is trying to achieve with the community being served? So this is really tied to the organization goals, and it ties really closely into the next question, which is how does the organization measure and share progress towards their goals? So I wanted to say that measuring and sharing progress might not look the way you expect it to. If you think about how you measure your progress in your own life or in your own work, it might not be in the same format that organizations are working with here. Some of them do have clear data and metrics available that they've sent to us or they're on their websites. Others might focus on storytelling or other ways to capture their progress. So I encourage you to keep an open mind on that. The fifth question is, what does accountability look like for this organization? And the LOIs, of course, address the question of accountability, and it's one of the four narrative questions on the LOI. And during research, this is your chance to assess further. I know many of the conversations in the work group during the LOI phase were around accountability. So this is a chance to go a little deeper, look at their board and key partners. Does their staff have the lived experience of the community being served? We want to encourage you to remember that representative leadership is important, but it's only part of accountability, right? So accountability is complex and nuanced and really different for each organization. So we're pushing you to go a little bit deeper with this, which is really different for each organization and might be hard to find in this phase. I do not suggest looking up a board member on LinkedIn to try to determine their identity, whether racial or gender or otherwise, from their headshot. I want to remind you that we don't know how someone identifies based on a photo, and that being the same race or gender identity as the community being served doesn't automatically mean that there's inherently accountability. Instead, I really encourage you to read those bios and try to understand if there's that connection to the community. Do they have a similar lived experience? Things like that. So that's number 5. And then the last question we tweaked a little bit this year. Our language for number 6 is, how do they infuse a commitment to equity in their organization? How does that commitment show up as a priority in their program design and leadership? So we really want to understand their organizational commitment to equity, not just one program or one person on the leadership team. So, really trying to get at, has working with and listening to the community been a part of their work since the beginning, or is it something that they're taking on in a new way and really doing very thoughtfully? Do they have an internal commitment to equity? Do they talk about it publicly? Is there an equity statement on their website? Things like that. Can you tell if it's a priority? Is there a clear connection between the internal commitment that they might talk about and the work and how it's designed and implemented in the community? So this is a way to sort of go deeper beyond accountability and a way to see the equity lens in action. And we added in this part around program design and leadership to help you focus that approach. So equity can show up in every different parts of the organization. We want to get that organization-wide understanding, but to focus it a little bit on program design and leadership, we thought would be helpful at this point. Okay, I want to ask if there's any questions around our 6 key questions before I dive into how to research. And I can't see you all. So if you could do the raise hand or either come off mute and ask your question or put it in the chat, any of those work for me. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to keep us moving forward and we'll have time for questions.
Aru has a question, Aviva.
Oh, thank you, Maria. Go ahead, Aru.
So I had a question about how important the financials will be. Some will be very detailed, some not so. And some will not have so many reserves because they've used them up, in the past few years. So when we are comparing organizations, what priority do we give to the financial aspect of an organization?
Oh, it's such a good question, Aru, and I love the framing too, because I mean, it has been a tough several years for nonprofits. Absolutely. So Maria is going to dive deeper into financials later on. I will share that you'll have a budget, and then Maria will go over how to look at the 990 just in a moment here. The budgets might look really different. Some of them don't have a 2024 budget approved yet. So we have a 2023 budget for you. Some of them have a lot of detail in the budget, some of them don't. So I think it'll be an exercise in trust for sure, and also looking to other sources to find more information. Maria, did you want to talk about that at all now before your portion, or just save it for your section later on?
Yeah, let's save it. I'm jotting down to mention something about reserves. I sort of go into this a little bit when we talk about bias, but yeah, we'll get there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question, Aru. Awesome. And did I miss anyone else? I apologize that I can't see you.
Can you go back to the
Carol Down
previous
has a question.
slide?
Go back to the previous slide. Yes. The first of the three key questions.
And Aviva, Carol Gown has a question then.
Great. And Sharon, did you have a question about this slide, or you just wanted to see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll go to Carol.
So when will we have an opportunity to ask a few questions of the organization when we need a little more information? And do we do it through you? And how do we find out what you're going to be asking of what we like? Because you don't always ask, for various reasons.
Yeah, exactly. So we, the first time we did this process, we had an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. We did not do that last year, and we will not be doing that again this year. So if there are questions or things you can't find, I'd be happy to help you try to track things down. And then I think that all of those things that come up that you're curious about or you want to know more about would be great to include as ideas for topics in the conversations itself, which is the next stage of the grant process.
And just to follow up, did you ask the organizations if they have submitted prior proposals to organizations, whether that they can, that's one of the things that would be useful for them to include. Those have been very helpful in the past.
Oh, I agree, Carol. It's helpful. It's also interesting, right, to see what other people ask organizations to answer. So yes, so part of the materials, I included a couple different examples of things that organizations have included in the past, and that included past grant applications. So, and several of them did share past grant applications. So when you get into Reviewer and you start looking at the attachments, you'll see several of them did opt to include that. Not all of them. But I did notice more this year that, it said, oh, I have this on hand. I'll just share this grant application.
So then, Aviva, what do you actually ask them for?
Yeah, I asked them for a budget and anything else they'd like to share to guide us in our research. And I say that they could include things like an annual report, a grant application that was submitted to another funder. If they have a video, maybe they just put together a video for their gala and they want to share that video. If they have any other documents, several of them sent one-pager documents that they might have to introduce their work to folks who are new to their work. Or even advice around where to find information. For some organizations, they don't really update their website, or some said, hey, we are in the middle of updating our website. It should be done soon, or we just updated it and we're really excited that it's up to date. Or, I really don't use a website. I use Facebook, and that's, here's the link to find where we update things on Facebook. So try to make it very open-ended so that they feel less pressure to submit or create materials for us. That's not the goal. But if there's things that they have on hand that we want us to know, or they want us to know where to find information, that was sort of the focus of the offer.
Great, thanks.
Of course. Good question, Sharon.
Yeah, so hi, Aviva, it's Diane.
Hi, Diane, go ahead.
Okay, there are a couple of things I want to just point out from my experience, which is looking at the website has all kinds of hidden treasure. There are other pieces of hidden treasure that you may find by looking at other grantors, because they may have information about the organization on their website. So that's been useful. And I want to say that other grant applications that they have provided to us have been really useful and helpful in understanding how much of what they gave to us was cut and paste and how much of it really was tailored to Women's Washington Foundation. So the sleuthing part is interesting and often takes some unexpected turns. And then for some of the smaller organizations, there just really isn't a lot. So it really varies, but I just wanted to mention those few things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience, Diana. It's spot on. Some organizations feel like everything's there, can just read it, and I have a good sense of all of the programs and the organization and everything. And some you might say, wow, there's really not a lot of information, and it might take a little more work. And I see Sarah's question as well around Charity Navigator, which is a great question. And I'm going to take this as an opportunity to go into the how, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. All right. So now that you have the research goals, those 6 questions, I want you to know where to find things, including places like Charity Navigator, which Sarah mentioned. So our biggest challenge overall, sort of big picture, will be handling potential discomfort of not having information we might be used to having, like a formal grant proposal tailored just to us, which Diane mentioned. The benefit, however, is that instead of seeing an application that's just for us, we get to see how organizations communicate to their own communities or communicate to other funders or, internally. So from the last couple of years, what we've found is that while this comfort can be challenging, especially when you're having a hard time finding information, together we work together and we're able to get the information we need to make decisions. I would encourage you to start with the website. Definitely lots of hidden troves of information on many websites. To get a larger picture of the operations, I recommend checking out their current staff members or board members lists and read the bios if they have them. Check out their blog or their updates section. They might have a list of upcoming events or archived newsletters. Sign up for the newsletter. You might get one while you're doing research and get some good current information. Some organizations have also shared annual reports or other financials on their website, even if they didn't share them specifically with us as part of the research. So you can take a look for those. They are a great resource for understanding the budget and operations side of things. The next thing I would encourage you to take a look at is social media. Even if you are not a social media person, often organizations will list their social media networks on the website, so you can just go directly to their page. You don't have to search, but you can sometimes just search an organization by name. Organizations that are active on advocacy used to be more active on Twitter, not so sure so much anymore. A lot of arts organizations use YouTube or Flickr or Vimeo or places like that to share their work. And LinkedIn is a great place to look for a staff or board member list if they're not listed on the organization's website. Just keep in mind it might not be that up to date. It might have folks who aren't on staff or aren't on the board anymore. If you haven't already, you can use the IRS database or another resource to verify an organization's tax exempt status. And of course, all of this is included in the research guide with links and everything like that. I want to remind you that some organizations will have fiscal sponsors. So they will use that organization's EIN or tax ID to apply for funding. Others may have budgets that are smaller than $50,000 and aren't required to file full 990s. So instead, those organizations file a 990N, which is an e-postcard to verify that they have gross receipts less than 50K. I also encourage other online research, searching in Google for additional media, news articles, recorded speaking engagements, research reports that might have been authored or quoted in, that kind of thing. Offline research is also encouraged. So if possible, maybe they have an event coming up in the next couple of weeks that you can attend, lots of webinars are happening these days. Consider reaching out to a funder that's listed on their website to learn more about why they funded them. There was a group last year, it was hard to find information. So the team of researchers reached out to a funder and found out lots of great information. If this feels intimidating, just go for it, send an email pick up the phone. You might be surprised by the response. Many funders really do welcome an opportunity to share more about their grantees. I know I do if anyone calls me up. And if they list other collaborators or partners on the website, you can research those organizations as well to get a better sense of who they work with outside of their internal operations. So that's the where to research. Before I hand it over to Maria to talk all things finance, I want to briefly touch on a document that's in your Dropbox. I don't think I have time to go through it all right now, but it's our philanthropy myths. So these are just things to keep in mind in research. I encourage you to point out the myths when you hear them in your group discussions. And I wanted to highlight one around data for you real quick, which is really around our expectations around progress or outcomes. Data collection is time consuming and expensive. So especially these teeny tiny orgs that don't have a large budget probably don't have room in that small budget for that data collection. And we really believe that great work can be done by organizations that don't have that extensive data in their, in their arsenal of information to share with us. So I encourage you to keep that in mind as a myth. So that's all I have for you today. Let me just check the chat here. Joyce has a note in here about looking at the website for applying for jobs. Can yield some interesting information. Absolutely. Looking at a job posting is a great way to know how organizations are, advertising themselves to potential applicants. And Barbara shared their information about the national regional context for an organization's work is helpful from national research or advocacy orgs. Absolutely, Barbara. And some of these organizations did share, researched things that they were involved in, but always great if you have a little bit of time to do that broader spectrum research on the priority itself. Thank you for those great comments. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Maria now. And Maria, I will keep screen sharing until you would like to move to your other examples.
That's fine. You don't need to. I can certainly take over. And at this point, if that makes it easier. But for now, yeah, this is fine. All right. Hello, everybody. Evaluating financials with an equity lens. This is may seem the financials are fairly straightforward, right? That bias doesn't really impact how we look at a sheet of numbers, but it does. So we're going to talk a bit about how to read financials with an understanding that there is a story behind these numbers, and that if you read it right, you can see far more than this what's on that balance sheet. The first thing, though, before we dive into a spreadsheet of numbers is to be sure we're aware of our own biases. We've talked a little bit about bias already today, but it bears repeating. The bias can show up in the form of assumptions we make about how financials should look, or what the budget size should be to accomplish their programs. As you start to look at an organization's financial records, consider that your understanding of what it takes to financially support an organization is informed only by the organizations you are already familiar with. If you find yourself wary of an organization's financials, think hard on whether something is wrong. Are you really seeing fraud, naivete, or is it just difference? And that difference, or frankly, your lack of understanding, is what is making you uncomfortable. So remember that it's okay to not understand what you're seeing or to need more explanation. This question around bias, born out of what you already know, holds true for nonprofit organizations. Often in nonprofits led by communities of color, there is less proximity to wealth, and there might not be the banking relationships that you're used to seeing. Having access to credit is harder for organizations led by people of color. That kind of banking access enables some organizations to build financial capacity with a credit line, while others are unable to enjoy that support. Philanthropic redlining and systemic underfunding and lack of investment in infrastructure leads to balance sheets that look different in organizations led by people of color. This is compounded by sexism when looking at organizations led by women of color. Indeed, that this bias was part of our own world for many years is one of the reasons we began our Rest and Repair Awards, because we at Washington Women's Foundation had failed to recognize the work that was being done by women of color in nonprofit leadership. So I say this not because I want to shame anybody or I want anybody to feel guilty. Guilt is really kind of a useless emotion. I say this because now we know and we can do better. And honestly, we have. In recent years, we've done a lot better in terms of who it is that we're actually funding and supporting, where we're seeing real risk versus our own inherent biases. Finally, the impact of the pandemic on nonprofits continues to ripple. When you think about financials, some organizations may mention how the pandemic changed their finances, from getting PPP loans to changing fundraising plans and more. Do consider that as you evaluate an organization's financials. I will say the arts organizations, especially those who have performing arts in their in the way in which they operate, have been hard hit and they have not recovered. So be prepared. If you see in arts organizations in particular, a real impact of that pandemic still rippling through their financial milieu. And that speaks again also to reserves. To Aru's point, reserves are great, but I will tell you, I have been in very, very few nonprofits after 20 years in this industry with reserves that are particularly healthy. And that is because 3 to 6 months of cash on hand is hard to find, especially for organizations that are more grassroots, that are really trying something new, that are doing things that make, to be really honest, wealthy people uncomfortable. Those organizations often don't have the kind of reserves you want to see, because they're not being funded by people in power who don't want them to succeed. So it's important to remember that reserves mean that an organization has wealth somewhere behind it, or yes, perhaps they've done really, really well in organizing their structures and the way their finances work. But there are organizations that this community has funded in the past that I worked for, that I know from the inside did not have the kind of reserves that I think people thought they did. So be aware of how oftentimes how little those reserves will tell you. It's great when they have them. That's super. 6 months cash on hand, fantastic. Pretty rare, in my opinion, and in my experience. Two main questions. Can you, everybody? So there's two sort of main questions that we're going to be asking as we go into this financial assessments. One, does the organization appear to be financially healthy? Yeah, you can look at reserves. You can look and see what their budgets are. We're going to go more deeply into how you can determine this in just a minute. And the second question, is there anything that you find in those financial records that needs deeper explanation? We are not here for gotcha, right? We're here to find out. We're here to discover. We're here to take a look. Next slide. Before we dive in, however, a reminder. As the Seattle Foundation pointed out in Grant Making Basics, no foundation officer has ever proclaimed, I wasn't really impressed by their project, but the financial accounting looks so good, I decided to recommend the grant anyway. We are working with organizations that are trying to address some of the thorniest questions of our society, most of which have been with us for generations. Risk is inherent in the work. Let yourself believe in possibility, even as you look at spreadsheets. Start out from a place of trust and belief in their competence. Nonprofit workers are professionals. Accept that. And remember, you can tell a lot about what an organization values if you look at their budgets. So let's do that now. Where do you find financial information? For large enough organizations, those ones that are over that 50,000 marker, you can find IRS forms, 990s. They're a great place to start, with the added benefit of being publicly available to anyone who wants to see them. We'll show you how to find and read a 990 in just a minute. The second spot that you can look for is annual reports. Most organizations do annual reports that have a financial page somewhere in that report. I will tell you, this annual report experience is not something that all organizations do, and they can look very, very different. Our annual report, for instance, last year, we dumped the whole idea of like some big document and have 2 pages, 1 page with some numbers, the other page with our financials. If you want to know the kind of work that Washington Women's Foundation does, I always point people to our giving guide, because that is our work, right? All those grants that we give out. So people have different ways of expressing that, but annual reports, by and large, always will have a financial section. That finance section is usually very high level, and you may want something more granular when you're looking at these organizations' financials. So be aware of that. This is a high level look, and often one that comes out of an audit numbers as opposed to like budget numbers, which are different. We have asked for budget documents from our applicants. So you will have those, but we do not dictate what it looks like. So those budgets are going to come in probably a lot of different formats. And that's okay. I'm going to show you a few samples today of different kinds of ways in which organizations have done their budgets from real organizations. I will say, for those of you who are here who are not going to be part of the call but are interested in how you research a nonprofit, these kinds of budgets that we're going to discuss today that are probably provided to us are not usually publicly available. Also, you need to bear in mind that budget documents are working documents and can absolutely be changed throughout a year if a board decides to do so. In fact, I know and have worked for organizations that did a readjusted budget midway through the year every single year. They changed. They're like, okay, we're 6 months in. What's our budget really going to look like? So there's snapshots in crystal ball gazing. It's what budgets often actually are. Hopefully useful and hopefully realistic, but that's what they are. Okay, Aviva, next slide. Before I go too deeply into the budget, I want to take a little minute to talk about fiscal sponsorships, because we do have organizations that choose this route in our applicant pool. Fiscal sponsorship can be a very sensible way to structure a nonprofit organization or a major project. And it can be for organizations of any size, from one artist to multi-million-dollar enterprises. So what is fiscal sponsorship? Fiscal sponsorship is a formal arrangement between two nonprofits that allows one organization to ask for gifts, grants, and other tax-deductible donations under the other organization's nonprofit status. I've seen this done with organizations that specialize in fiscal sponsorship, like Latino Community Foundation and Fractured Atlas. These are organizations that have a lot of fiscally sponsored organizations or artists under their umbrella. I've also been involved in two organizations that have fiscally sponsored other organizations that were really similar in mission or that were spin-off projects from the original organization. So you're a nonprofit, you have one department that's like really got some interesting stuff happening that's almost to the point of like, that needs to be its own nonprofit. You can make it its own nonprofit as a fiscal sponsor of your own, and then that can spin off and become its own nonprofit in the future. Usually a fiscal sponsor will take a small fee for the services they provide from the organization that they are sponsoring. So why would an organization do this? Why would you choose to be fiscally sponsored rather than being your own 501c3? The biggest reason is that if you do this, there's no need to hire admin and finance staff to manage your donor database and your tax receipts and your audits and your 990. That all gets done by the fiscal sponsor. Fiscal sponsorship also offers organizations the opportunity to provide tax deductibility for their donors without having to go through the 501c3 application process, which can be onerous and lengthy. And just so you know, the IRS is very, very backed up right now. There are organizations that have been waiting for their 501c3 status for over a year. They are not prompt at getting that to you. So applying for a 501c3 can take a long time. So a fiscal sponsorship can be that bridge while an organization is waiting for their 501c3 status to be approved. This is also another form of co-directorship, right? If a program is really taking off and the director of that program needs to function more independently, fiscal sponsorship of that program and that department is actually a really great idea. Because it alleviates the management of a lot of fiduciary responsibilities, fiscal sponsorship also is an option for lowering burnout for executive directors. I actually think that a lot more organizations should go the fiscal sponsorship route. Take that burden of doing all of that financial stuff off of your plate and focus on the work that you want to get done. The Latino Community Foundation decided as a foundation that to support the Hispanic community in Washington state, it made more sense for them to offer themselves as a fiscal sponsor organization to smaller, more grassroots organizations. They took that on as one of the responsibilities of their foundation to their community, to be a space where people could do fiscal sponsorship of small grassroots orgs. It's also important to note, as I said before, that just because an org is being fiscally sponsored does not mean that it is necessarily small. Latino Community Fund, I know, started out with some organizations that were small that have now become multi-million-dollar statewide organizations, have continued that fiscal sponsorship, so their EDs don't have to think too much about all that fiduciary stuff. All right. the 990s. This is going to be a very brief look at 990s. If you're interested in a deeper dive, I am happy to do like one-on-one tutorials about how 990 fits together. But for now, I just want to acquaint you with what's in them, because there's a lot of information in the 990s. All right, Aviva, go ahead and pop me over. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Let me escape out here for a second. All right, so we're gonna start looking at some actual documents. And I'm going to talk to you for just a second. So the first thing you need to know about a 990, of course, is where to find them. You can't go to websites. Here's the spot to go, which is the irs.gov/charities. And I can put that link into, I think you have it, or you will have it. But let me go ahead and show you what you find when you do that. So we're going to share desktop 2. Share. All right. Can everyone see the IRS stock? Looks like you can. All right. This is what, when you go to irs.gov/charities, this is the site that will show up. And there's a tax exempt organization search tool, which we will do. We're going to look at ourselves because that's the easiest thing to look at. So, and my internet has been creaky today, so we'll see if it behaves itself. So you want to search for a tax exempt organization. And you can see there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. You're going to just search all, because there's different databases where you can find stuff. Just search all. EINs, if you have it, I think a lot of our nonprofits provide that, so you should have that. But you can also put in organization names. So we're going to go ahead and put in Washington Foundation. Oops, if you know how to spell. And you'll see you'll do this, and it'll search all the databases. And it says, there's no such organization. And we are all sitting here going, what do you mean? The thing with the IRS is that there's lots of stuff that you have to remember about the way you type in the name, if you do name, that can get you a totally different answer. So do not assume that just because you looked it up, it's not there. That's why the EIN is usually a better route if you want to look something up on this. So here we are, right? They don't do apostrophes. So now you know. And you look this up and you see, okay, this organization evidently hasn't filed their taxes for the last year or so. When I told you the IRS was backed up, and 2020 seems to be missing. When I told you the IRS is backed up, this is what I mean. You will go to this website and you may not find everything. There's hiccups, there's stuff missing. You'll still get a 990. It may not be the most recent one. It may have missing ones. So be aware of the fact that there are some hiccups happening with the IRS. So the other place you can go to sort of start this journey, if you can't find it, if this is not up to date, Charity Navigator sometimes I think has tax information. Publicola has some, but I also go to the website, right? Go to the website of the organization. Look there we are. And take a look. We, and many organizations do, just post all of their stuff online. So come on, you can do it. It's the website. Okay. There's all of our annual reports. And here's our financial reports. As you can see, we do in fact have tax returns for many, many years, even if the IRS doesn't see them. I'm going to go ahead and take a look. Let's look at the 2021, partially because honestly, I didn't have time to update all of my notes. So we're going to look at the 2020 990. It's going to give us lots of information about Washington Women's Foundation and about us. So first thing, here's what the document looks like, right? The first thing that you can see is a number of board members that this organization has that are voting. We have 18 board members that were voting in 2021. We can look and see how many employees were employed during the year of the 990. Now you'll notice that this says 8 and we only have 5 employees. So what happened? Turnover happened, right? You can see a lot of numbers happening that will all be employed 8 people. Not all of them were with us the entire year. You can also see the number of volunteers. I hope you are all very much aware of how much work is done here at Washington Women's Foundation by all of you. by all of our volunteers. This 990 says, and what you see and when you look at this is an organization that's primarily driven by volunteers with a very small staff. Bingo, that is exactly what we are, right? The next section. Here are some financials. There's basic finances. We made less in 2021 than 2020. Due in large part to a big bequest that came in 2020, PPP dollars that came in. There's a lot of stuff that happened in 2020 that is the reason why there's less dollars of the following year. So remember that a decline in income doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. Sometimes stuff happens. I do like to look at the previous year if this is something I have a question about. And you can do that, not leaving this document at all. That's like, oh, they really had a drop. I wonder if that's something that I should be paying attention to. Right down here, if you scroll far enough, there's lots of pieces of paper. This is in every single 990, is 5 years of how much money came in and how much money did they spend, right? It's in part 2, but you can see in 2021 is 134. 1.34 million. In 2020, 1.65. In 2019, 1.16. In 2018, 1.33. In 2017, 1.83. Our numbers hover between 1.1 and 1.5 to 1.7 for the last 5 years. This is pretty steady stuff. It can tell you whether or not what kind of ups and downs the organization is seeing. If you see a steady drop, in 5 years, every single year, the number's going down, there's a question. What's going on? What's happening here? What's that support look like? These are the kinds of things and trends that you can see in the 990 that a lot of people don't realize how much information is in here. You can also see in a 990, I want to make sure I don't go too deep because you can go a long way. You can see salary information. You can see how much did we spend on our salaries and here in expenses, benefits paid, salaries or other compensation. You can see we spent a little bit more in 2021 than we did in 2020. And that can be for a lot of different reasons. But you can also scroll down because what I find is that it's really helpful to look at executive salaries and compare that to total salary. Let me show you where that is. If you scroll down, you can see here's all of our board members, and you can see if you want to know how much I make, congratulations, you can look it up. This is the case for all nonprofits have to, like if they do a 990, they have to have the highest paid person listed here. Sometimes they have to have a couple of highest paid people listed there, right? Prominent leaders of the organization. If you look at this number, you can also scroll back up and look at how much money do they spend overall in salaries. And you can start getting a feel for just what kind of range you're looking at with a salary, right? My salary is about 29% out of the total salaries. So the other 71% is going to our other 3.5 employees. I make about 2.5 times the lowest paid employee at Washington Women's Foundation. If an executive salary is eating half of the line or more, and there's a lot of employees, I might have a question about that, right? What kind of equity is happening within this organization if that's the case? It's a question. The other thing I look at a salary line is what's happened year over year. For this year, I see salaries actually went up. I might want to go back in time and see if that number has been increasing. Go to other 990s, see if that number keeps getting bigger. That helps me ask questions like, are their finances strong enough to adequately compensate their staff? Does that number never really change? If it never really changes year over year, that might spark a question about whether or not they're balancing their budget on the backs of their staff. Please note that increases don't necessarily match inflation or COLA. Some organizations specifically set increases every year instead of doing a COLA. That's great. Equity can show up in a lot of different ways here, but watching that salary line is a great way to tell whether or not what's happening inside the organization when it comes to how their staff are being compensated. Okay. So that's sort of the secrets of the 990. Now we're going to go to how to read a budget. And, you know, budgets, as I mentioned before, budgets can look really different. I'm going to show you a few. It's important to remember that budgets are not set in stone. They are not audited statements. They are not IRS documents. They are not legal documents. They are often fluid and flexible, and they should be seen as a guidebook and not a law book, right? This is not a legal document, so please bear that in mind when you see a budget. We're going to talk for just a minute about accrual versus cash flow budgeting, and I'm going to end with Grace Not Gotcha. But before I do that, we're going to just go ahead and take a look at some budgets, because that's the easiest thing. So this is a snapshot of an organization in 2021. This was their budget. They estimated at the beginning of that year they were going to bring in about almost $1.3 million in government grants and contracts. They were going to be able to spend about $2.8 million over the course of the year, right? Here's their expenses. Or total support. I'm sorry, they were going to bring that much in. And you'll notice that their total expenses is way more than their total support and revenue. Right? They have a net income loss of $100,000. This is not actually cause for concern, because this is an accrual budget. It is really important when you look at budgets, the budgets that you receive, to know whether or not you're looking at an accrual budget or a cash budget, because they're different. A cash budget is exactly that. Let me just stop share for a second. A cash budget is cash in, cash out. So $100 is coming into your organization, into your bank account, and $100 is going out, or 98 or 101. If you're looking at a cash flow budget and you see negative numbers, the question you need to ask would pertain to what their cash on hand looks like. How much do they have sitting in the bank? You can spend more than you take in if you have a savings account. Cash budget, money in, money out. If it's negative, you need to ask questions about their cash on hand, their liquidity of investments. A negative cash budget is not necessarily a sign of anything going wrong. It could, in fact, be the sign of something going really right. A cash budget is different than an accrual budget. You will probably be receiving accrual budgets, because that's what most nonprofits work with, because that's what GAAP accounting for nonprofits demands. It's what you see on 990s, in audit documents. It's pretty typical. So accrual accounting, the thing you have to remember when you are looking at an accrual accounting budget is that promises, otherwise known as pledges, count. They operate differently than you might assume. They count both in the revenue and expenses differently than than a cash count would look like. So, for example, let's say your organization gets a pledge from a foundation or a donor for a gift of $150 to be paid in 3 annual installments of $50 each. The pledge is a promise from the donor that they will send you $50 every year for 3 years. You do not have that $150 in cash. You have a promise. In accrual accounting, that promise is put into the budget in the revenue line as if it were cash. So in the revenue income, you will have that full $150 will show up in that revenue. In subsequent years, so it'll look like that year you got like, wow, you got $150. Look, their budget's like $250 now, right? Because it's showing up there as income. In subsequent years, the $50 gets paid out, every year. The next year, you get that $50 in cash. You spend that $50 in cash, but it does not going to show up in the income side. It will only show up in the expenses side, because now you've spent that $50. That $50 coming in cash isn't going to show up anywhere on the income statement. So it'll look like you're overspent. It'll look like you spent an extra $50 that you didn't have. You had it in a promise from the year before. It's already been counted, so GAAP says you can't count it again. It is very confusing, but that is how it works. So let's go back to the Excel for a second. Let me show you what that looks like. This budget is absolutely fine. I happen to know that this organization got a huge grant, a pledge the year before, and they were spending it here, right? They got a $300,000 pledge. every year from a very wealthy foundation. And so they can bring in 2.7 million this year and spend 5.7 million. Doesn't mean they don't know how to do their finances. You need to know whether it's accrual or cash. I'm going to show you on this document. This is one that I use to demonstrate this to my students. This was actually how I used to do my budgeting, which looks really complicated, but as a development person, it was really, really handy because I could see everything right in front of me, including accrual and cash next to each other. So this is Maria's budgeting. And I've brought this budget through 5 different organizations in this town. So it's in a lot of places now. So the 2 important columns I want you to look at is F and G. And you can see here in this revenue line that there's a lot more millions for 2026 than there were in the accrual budget than there are for the cash flow budget. And that is all down to accrual versus cash and pledges. So you'll see here, lead donor number 1 is made a pledge of $500,000. In the accrual budget, you mark that down as $500,000. But in the cash flow budget, the only thing counted is the $125,000 payment on that pledge in the year for the year. When the next year comes, and you spend that $125,000 installment, it will not have shown up in the accrual for the next year, but it will absolutely have shown up in the cash flow. You can see that here with lead donor 2. You're going to pledge $200,000 in 2026. In 2026, the cash flow, he has a higher number. And part of that is because he's going to pledge this, but he's already paying on another pledge that came in previously, and he has his last $25,000 to pay. You can end up with some very strange numbers happening in and out, depending on whether or not it's an accrual or cash budget that you're looking at. And I'll show you that for us, for Washington Women's Foundation, we're an accrual budget organization. This is an early version of the WAWF budget. This is our budget for 2024 versus our budget for 2023. We do accrual accounting. We don't have a lot of multi-year pledges. What we do have, though, is multi-year funding that we do, right? We promise funds out to people that sometimes don't always get spent out in the first year. We also have funds that we spend in grants. Well, let me show you. If you scroll down here, you'll see our total income for 2023 was 1.29 is what we were budgeting for. And our total expenses were 1.9 million, which looks like we really don't know what we're doing when it comes to our finances, except, of course, that the Women and Girls Grants is being funded out of a fund that came from the WFA fund. So that's just money in the bank that we're spending. It's not showing up in our income anymore. It's already sitting in the bank. Same thing for the Rest and Repair Boards. It's $500,000 of that 1.9 million is actually money that was in the bank, right, that we spent. Negative doesn't mean bad. Please keep that in mind. The other thing that you'll see sometimes with a negative budget or with a really low budget, and I'm going to show you where we do this, and we're doing this year, is organizations that decide to tap those reserves. I call these investment budgets. This is when you've got working capital, you've got a lot of reserves, you have money on hand, you're like, you know what, we're going to take some of those dollars, we're going to invest it into our organization. This year, we are releasing $100,000 out of our working capital to invest into this organization, in part because you'll notice that our membership contribution is flat. We need to do something about that, by the way. Please bring your friends. This is fine because as you can see right here, our projected working capital, we have even more money than that sitting in the bank because that doesn't include our board discretionary fund. But we have, at the end of 2023, we had $925,000 in our working capital. We projected we'll go to 825. And that still is not even 6 months. We still are left with, there's another 300,000 some odd in our board discretionary fund. So we have like $1.2 million. It's still sitting out there. We're going to take some of that money, we're going to invest it in our work so that we can be a stronger organization. All nonprofits do this side of thing when you have that working capital. Other thing to think about when you look at reserves is, are they using some of those dollars to do something that's going to bolster the risk taking that they're making? In the end, anything you see that looks strange, on a 990 or a budget should not be viewed initially as suspicious or something that you've caught an organization doing. What it should be is a place for you to ask questions, to be curious. Why is this a negative number? Do you have a lot of cash on hand? Did you have some strong pledges last year? Is this an investment year for you? If you see something that you don't understand or seems really negative, please approach it with grace and not gotcha, right? Just remember to approach this with grace. These organizations are amazing, and they're usually doing it right. Aviva, did you want to take back over the screen share? Do you want me to just, I can go now if you'd like.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. Maria, I see a couple questions in the chat
Oh,
here
perfect.
for
Yeah,
you. Carol asked, how will we know if the budget we are looking at is cash-based or accrual-based?
I'm hoping that, and Aviva, I think that is actually a question that if it comes up, we should probably find out. I would tell you, most of them are going to be accrual. Carol, it's really rare for people to do cash budgets. I have seen cash budgets most used with really small organizations. So those are the ones that in particular, I think I have the question. I think, Aviva, that's a question that can be asked of an organization if there's any question about it. Because
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
that's one that I think we have to go back and say, hey, accrual or cash, which one are you working on? It's a really simple ask. So we'll ask, Carol, if it's not obvious.
If you don't know, we'll ask.
Absolutely.
And then a question from Sarah. Does the research phase include understanding these budget nuances within the accrual budgets that explain what otherwise looks odd?
You may or may not have that information. I think what I want to make sure we underscore is that seeing some sort of odd things is a place for questions that can be brought up in the conversation phase. If you're like, you know what, I have some questions about that. Looking back at a 990 can help you see whether or not that's what's sort of happening. If it's an organization that's pretty big and you see some big spike the year before and then suddenly a drop in the numbers the next year in the 990, that's the likelihood they had a pledge that they're spending on. That was something that oh yes, thank you, Catherine. That's right. The 990 will tell you whether it's accrual or cash. I completely forgot that was on there. On the 990, there's a checkbox that says whether or not you're looking at accrual or cash accounting on the 990. So many. I'm trying to think of the last time I saw a cash accounting organization. I think it really is with the little ones. Because when you get to big enough size, you have to use accrual. But this is a place for questions, and it's a place that we can ask at the conversation stage. And it's a place where the going back in time on those 990s, if you can show you the pattern. This fundraising ratio. Oh, Barbara. This is a pet peeve of mine. So let's talk about it. So what Barbara Miller is asking in the question is, can you speak to the fundraising ratio between admin and program expenses, and also the judgments made regarding public and private money? I'm going to take the first question first. The ratio between admin and program. So for a long time, there was this big idea that you should only spend 10% of your total, the dollar should be spent on operations, on fundraising, etc. That is, well, you know, I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat, but that is a real, I'll stop share for a second. That is a really short-sighted way to see the way in which charities operate. Because by and large, the majority of organizations, the biggest expense they have is their people, because the work that they do is people work. So Northwest Immigrant Rights Project had a huge programming budget for people. Huge salaries, and you know why? Because they're lawyers. The only thing they did was do legal work, and everything they did in their programs was people. So it's critically important to understand the organization before you make judgments about what they're doing. You will see fundraising percentages that will increase if an organization is in the middle of a capital campaign. If an organization is in a growth, is doing a big growth push. An organization is small. Sometimes that fundraising budget gets really high. You know why? Fundraisers are really expensive. And they're expensive because nobody wants to do it. And so they're really much in demand. And you have to spend more on your fundraisers than you would on other programming staff sometimes in order to bring people in. When I was working at Path with Art, I was making more money than my ED. That happens. So be aware that fundraising staff, hiring professional fundraisers sometimes is going to cost people money, especially if they're small. It's going to be a bigger chunk of their budget than people always give people credit for. Know the organization, like recognize that there might be something going on inside that necessitates that imbalance. Now, if you start seeing like 50, 75% is going into fundraising, obviously that would be a problem, but that's very, very unlikely to be the case. I will say you also have to pay attention to a line in the budget called the in-kind line, because I have seen organizations that are like, look how we have all of this fundraising, and you'll see a huge in-kind line. If you get a lot of donations of stuff, Treehouse, right? Where they get a lot of donations of food and clothes and toys and all that. You get a lot of donation of stuff. Those dollars have to show up on the income and expense line, but it makes the ratios of what's happening with fundraising really skewed towards looking like you only are spending like 10% on your programming. Well, that's not entirely true, because a huge chunk of the dollars that are coming in are things. So it's important to understand the organization beyond just the spreadsheet. How we know, let me slow down. And yes, if these questions can be carried over to conversations, how much weight should we put on financials in our research phase? That's a good question, Joyce. I think this is a great place for you to dive in and take a look. There are certainly things you can see on that 990 that can spark the questions. So I think you think of it more as like if you have a lot of questions, if you're like, wow, I'm getting a lot of questions as I go through these financials, that can be a flag. I think that's allowed to be a flag. But if everything else looks great, you're like, you know what? Here's some questions we should probably ask, but I think we can go ahead. I don't think it's a weight of this question would make or break the situation, but it's definitely a question of we have questions. Use the research phase as a space to also bring in more questions if you have them for the people that are going to be doing the conversations, because it may not be you, right? So you can point ahead to your fellow members and be like, hey, make sure to ask them about this, because it's kind of weird.
And I would just add to that, it's such a good question. And you'll
Yeah.
notice that one of our 6 key research questions, we don't have a research question on financials. We're not asking you to report out on what you found on the financials. So really what we're hoping you'll do is use the financials as an opportunity to get to know organizations better. As Maria has just showed, you can learn a lot about organizations just by reading a budget and a 990. And that informs your research to give you that side of things, that perspective, but it shouldn't make or break. Yeah,
Right.
Maria, go ahead.
I did forget to point out on the 990, if you scroll down in a 990, there's a section where they talk about their programs. They'll have like words, narrative sections of what their programs are. And in those narrative sections, there's a line that shows how much they spend on each one of those programs. So if you go and look at Washington Women's Foundation's 990, it'll be like, here's our grants and here's how much we spent on that one. Here's this grant, here's how much we spent on that one. And that will include programming as well as, or like the staff salaries. It includes like, how much did you spend for this? I find that one a really interesting question, because that one shows me if they're talking about one program over here, as though somehow it's the key and the every end all and be all, but their actual dollars are going to another program over here. That's a really interesting question, because I'm like, well, the one where you're doing a lot of equity work, that one is the one you talked about, but the one where you're actually funding is not that one. That's a really interesting question to see, where their real values lie. Sorry,
Thanks,
I forgot
Maria.
to show that to you.
And then the part of Barbara's question was about public-private money. Did you touch on what you wanted to
Yeah.
say there?
So public-private money, a lot of organizations get a lot of their dollars from the government. The United States government uses nonprofit organizations as a cheap way to do the work that they're supposed to be doing, to be brutally honest, and not to bring too many politics in it, but that's what nonprofits do, right? And so the government will pay nonprofits to do that work. So then it doesn't have to be part of the government's work. For instance, I will use Northwest Immigrant Rights Project as an example. Northwest Immigrant Rights Project many years ago brought a legal case and a lawsuit against the federal government to demand that a lawyer be provided to people seeking, status here in the United States who were mentally disabled. So if you did not have the capacity to argue your case, since you're not entitled to a lawyer in the immigration courts, NERP said, no, if you are mentally incapacitated, you should have rights to a lawyer. And the reason they did that is because they discovered through another immigrant down at the detention center that a man had been in that detention center for 5 years who had never gotten out because he was convinced he lived on Mars. And one of the things you have to do as an immigration court is you have to know where this person is from. This person was clearly mentally ill. And so he had just sat in that detention center for 5 years because no one had bothered to get him a lawyer. NERP found out, and they said, you know what? Everyone should get a lawyer who is mentally incapacitated. This case went up to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit said, yeah, that's totally true. You need to provide a lawyer. It was not further, and it did not get pushed up to the Supreme Court because the United States government did not want to have to provide lawyers for the entire country. So in the Ninth Circuit, you have to provide a lawyer to anybody who's mentally incapacitated in the immigration system because NERP did that lawsuit. The rest of the United States, that is not the case. In the Ninth Circuit, the government pays NERP whenever they have a case. That is, they pays NERP to be the lawyers for the people to defend these folks in immigration court. Because they don't have a defendant, there's no court defender in immigration court. We got a sizable amount of money from the federal government to do that work throughout in the Ninth Circuit here in Washington State. That shows up as one of our government contracts, right? It was a government contract, the government's paying us to do that, but it shows up as income and contribution and a grant in that budget. Just because you get a lot of money from the government, doesn't mean the government is actually paying you the amount of money it costs for you to do the job, because the government has very strict rules about how much people get paid that are very unrealistic, which I know in Washington State they're trying to do something about, but it's not great. Usually you need money to supplement those dollars because it's not enough. So don't let the public-private bias really guide you too much, because it means that organization is doing a service that isn't being provided by the United States government.
Thank
Questions?
you. Yeah, any other questions for Maria on the financial side of things? Super valuable insight. Thank you so much, Maria, for guiding us through this all. We are going to shift gears a little bit and move into our breakout rooms for each work group. So if you are not part of the research phase, but you want to be, stick around and I'll get you into a work group. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. Usually I'd like to have like a everybody share a reflection, but I want to make sure that everyone has enough time in their breakout rooms to connect with each other. And Joyce, I see that one last question. Can you go over where materials will be found? Absolutely. Thank you, Joyce. So I will send a follow-up email to the grant committee after this with the recording of this training, as well as a link to the Dropbox, which has every bit of information, including the templates for the research summaries and feedback forms and conversation questions, as well as just the research guide itself on how to research. So it'll all be in one easy to find spot. And all of the materials from organizations are already in Reviewer. So when you log in, I've added a label that says research phase. And so you can sort by that. So only see the 10 organizations and then navigate to their attachments for each organization to view what they've shared with us. Okay. Any last questions before I open the breakout rooms? Thank you all so much for your deep engagement, and enjoy your time in your breakout rooms. I think I've gotten everyone assigned. If you don't see an invitation, just look at the bottom of your screen and you should have the option to join. Okay.